We're going to change the shorthand methods to use on instead. We'll also consolidate our event handler functions, and finally, we'll talk about some issues when using the off method. This is the state that our code was in when we last used it. We can replace all the shorthand methods with the on method. We just need to make sure to specify the event type as the first parameter. We've changed all the event handlers to use the on method instead of the shorthand methods. Before we see why this is helpful, let's make sure it still works like it did with the shorthand methods. Yes, everything still works just as it did, so why go through all the trouble of changing the methods? Let's look at the click and double-click event handler functions. The code is almost identical. There's no reason to have separate event handlers that do exactly the same thing. jQuery lets us specify multiple event types as the first parameter to the on method. We can also do this with the bind and live methods. Let's combine the click and double-click handler functions. All we have to do is separate the event types with spaces, and jQuery will attach the same event handler for each of the event types. While we're at it, the first mouse down event handler is almost identical to the click and double-click handler. It just has the prevent default. We'll add that event type to the list also. That's one good reason to switch from the shorthand methods to the on method. Our code becomes easier to maintain with fewer event handler functions. Now let's take a look at the results of using 2 handlers instead of 4. We get exactly the same results for click and mouse down events. We don't get the second mouse down event because stop propagation was called in the first handler function. The double click event no longer bubbles up, but we're getting selected text again. That's because the prevent default method isn't being called when the mouse down event processes. Since we're using a single event handler, we can add a simple check for when the mouse down event is being processed. If it is, we'll call the prevent default method on the event. We check the type property of the event parameter that's passed to our handler function and call the prevent default method only when it's a mouse down event. Let's run it and check the results. Now the text doesn't get selected, at least in Firefox. How can we handle it in Internet Explorer? We can bind another event type that is specific to Internet Explorer. It's called Select Start. Let's go ahead and load Internet Explorer just for this example. While we're here, let's see how the events process. The click works the same. When we double-click the embedded clickable element, we see that the text does get selected. The prevent default method that we include in the mouse down event processing isn't giving us the same result we got in Firefox. Also, notice that Internet Explorer only processes one mouse down and one click event prior to the double click event. That is another difference from Firefox and is useful to know. The Select Start event is how Internet Explorer notifies us that the user has started to select text in an element. Since we know we're dealing with Internet Explorer with this event, we can just return false to cancel any further processing. Let's look at this latest version in Internet Explorer to verify that the text is not selected when we double-click. The text does not get selected now. We can double-click on any clickable element and no text will be selected. Keep in mind, this only works for the clickable elements. Non-clickable elements will still be selected with the double-click. As mentioned earlier, we'd have to capture the select start on the body to prevent all selection throughout the page. We should verify that everything is still working in Firefox as well. We see that Firefox behaves the same as Internet Explorer when we double-click. Now that we've seen how to attach event handlers with the on method, let's look at how to remove them with the off method. Why would we want to do that? There are a couple of reasons. First of all, if we attach event handlers from script embedded in dynamically loaded content, those handlers will be attached every time that script runs, which would be every time the content is refreshed. Many developers have suffered through this problem. The first time they test the code, everything works as expected. As soon as the page is refreshed, all the events fire twice. Refresh the page again and everything fires 3 times. We've insulated ourselves from this problem by stopping propagation of our events and checking for that condition before we process the handler. Even though there may be multiple handlers attached due to the page refreshes, we'll only process the first one. We're really just masking the problem, however, because the browser is still attaching the handler functions repeatedly. Some processes may not be so straightforward, or an event handler may actually need to be propagated up to DOM. In these instances, we can't rely on stop propagation to protect us from handler functions that get attached multiple times. We need to have a mechanism to verify that our handler is attached to the event only once, or at least only as many times as we want, regardless of page refreshes. Another reason we may want to remove an event handler is if we write a new function that handles events differently than existing functions. We may wish to remove previously attached event handlers so we can start fresh with our new functionality. We may wish to alter the event processing logic temporarily, or alter it based on some business condition that is analyzed at runtime. In either case, we need to make sure that the event handler we want to attach isn't already attached. That's what the off method does for us. Let's look at how to use it. Generally, the off method is placed as the first method in the chain. This ensures that previously attached event handlers are removed. The simplest syntax is to call the off method with no parameters. This will cause jQuery to remove all handlers for all events for the selected elements. This is a drastic case, and we should be very sure we want to do such a thing before we make use of this syntax. For our sample page, we know it will be okay. For a larger system or a library of functions, we would rather specify exactly what event handlers we wish to remove. Now, we're telling jQuery to remove all the click event handlers from our selected elements. This will remove click handlers that we have previously attached, as well as any that are added by any other process. This is still a rather drastic measure, but at least it's only affecting click event handlers and nothing else. We've placed the off method as the first method in the chain. Let's place a copy as the last method in the chain to see how it works. Let's run this in Firefox to see what happens. By the way, what do you think will happen? We don't get any click messages. The last call to the off method removed them all. Let's go back to the code and move the off method to a different location than the end of the chain. We placed it between the two on methods, and notice we expanded the event types for the second on method to include click. We'll run Firefox to see the results. Now we see the second click message instead of the first. This shows that the first click handler was removed and only the second handler is processing. We're getting multiple click messages because the second handler doesn't call stop propagation. Let's look at one other syntax for the off method. We can remove handlers for more than one event type, just like we could attach handlers for more than one event type. The syntax is the same. We've added the mouse down event to the list of event handlers to remove. Let's take a look at that in Firefox. As we click, we get the messages from the second handler, and they show that the event is processed by the parent elements too. We didn't stop propagation in the second event handler, so the event bubbled up the DOM. This highlights the importance of planning your event processing and making sure any handlers you add play nicely with other handlers and aren't necessary to the event lifecycle. There are a lot of methods available in jQuery for attaching event handlers. The preferred methods to use are on and off. Support for the others may be dropped at some point in the future.